In May 1945, weeks after the fighting in Europe had ended, British clerks working in a captured records depot began opening German crates that had been shipped west ahead of the advancing armies. The labels were intact, the seals unbroken. Inside were war logs, unit diaries, strength returns, casualty summaries, organized with a disciplined precision Germany had prided itself on for decades. At first glance, the paperwork looked reassuringly complete. Dates were filled in, columns were aligned, totals were neatly calculated. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. The numbers were too orderly. Losses, replacements, and men listed as missing appeared balanced in a way that did not match the chaos of the final months of the war. By the spring of 1945, the German army had collapsed across multiple fronts, yet these documents suggested continuity. Units that should have been shattered still appeared administratively intact. Casualty figures seemed restrained, even modest, for formations that had been in constant retreat under overwhelming Allied pressure. For British experts trained to read military systems as much as military events, this neatness raised alarms rather than confidence. Throughout the war, German formations had maintained meticulous records. Daily Kriegstagebuch entries tracked operations. Strength returns flowed upward through corps and army headquarters. Casualty reports were categorized, summarized, and forwarded through a bureaucracy designed to produce clarity. To an untrained eye, it looked like a complete picture. To British analysts, it looked like a map with missing road routes that should have existed but simply weren't there. By late 1944, Allied intelligence already suspected Germany was suffering catastrophic manpower losses. These documents suggested something more disturbing. The losses were not just severe. They were being managed on paper, categorized, deferred, and absorbed by the reporting system itself. This was not yet proof of deception. It was something subtler. The question was not whether Germany was losing men. That much was undeniable. The question was whether the German reporting system had begun hiding the scale of those losses from its own leadership, smoothing the numbers to preserve the appearance of control. Once that possibility emerged, every table, every return, every handwritten annotation became suspect. The documents were no longer just records, they were evidence, and as British experts began comparing them to what they already knew from the battlefield, the sense grew that these crates did not contain a history of the war as it was fought, but a version of the war as Germany needed to believe it was still being fought. To understand what British investigators were seeing, it was essential to understand how the German army defined loss. Military bureaucracies do not record suffering. They record categories: killed, wounded, missing, sick, captured. Each category followed a different administrative route with different implications for morale, replacement, and accountability. In a stable system, those paths eventually converge. In a collapsing one, they become places where reality disappears. A soldier listed as killed required confirmation, paperwork, and finality. A soldier listed as missing required none of that. He could be dead, captured, cut off, or simply unreported. In the final year of the war, missing became a warehouse for uncertainty. British analysts understood that this ambiguity was not a flaw in the data, it was the data. The larger the missing category grew, the less the system was able or willing to resolve it. As British experts compared unit-level war diaries with higher-level summaries, patterns began to emerge. One anomaly stood out immediately. Rates of sickness were consistently low, even during periods of extreme exposure, retreat, and food shortages. Winter fighting, forced marches, and collapsing medical services should have driven non-combat losses upward. Instead, the paperwork emphasized combat casualties and replacements, preserving the impression of operational continuity. What mattered to the system was not an accurate medical portrait of the army, but a narrative in which formations remained viable. The tone of the war logs themselves told a parallel story. Early war entries described maneuvers, objectives, and coordination. By 1944, the language shifted. Entries spoke of shortages, improvisation, and delay. Entire days went unrecorded. Units were reduced to fragments, yet their administrative identities persisted. The paperwork still marched forward in orderly columns, but the army it described was shrinking into the margins. Companies became platoons, battalions became ad hoc groups, and still, the categories continued to function as if nothing fundamental had changed. At this point, British investigators stopped reading the documents as neutral records. They began reading them as artifacts of stress. The system was not simply recording losses, it was absorbing them, redistributing their impact across categories designed to delay recognition. Once that distinction became clear, the next step followed naturally. These documents could no longer be trusted at face value. They had to be audited methodically, skeptically, and without regard for the story they appeared to tell. The work of exposing these inconsistencies did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in offices, intelligence sections, and temporary headquarters where British analysts treated captured German records as a system under observation. These men and women were not searching for a single incriminating document. They were looking for pattern signals that emerged only when thousands of reports were read together. Their approach was built on a simple assumption. Paperwork could lie, but it could rarely lie consistently. A single false report might go unnoticed. A system under strain would reveal itself through contradiction. Analysts compared war diaries against prisoner interrogations, intercepted communications, and Allied battlefield reports. If a division reported a strength of 12,000 men but held a front with scattered resistance and no reserves, the truth was not in the number. It was in the gap between the number and reality. As the war progressed, those gaps multiplied. Casualties moved sideways through the system. Men were temporarily missing, reassigned, or delayed. Replacement figures arrived late or failed to match reported losses. Headquarters summaries lagged behind unit reports by weeks, sometimes months. In staff rooms across Britain, a quiet anxiety grew. If German losses were being understated, then Allied planners risked misunderstanding the enemy's true condition, either overestimating his resilience or misjudging the moment of collapse. By 1944, British manpower assessments had become a war within the war. Analysts were no longer just estimating enemy strength. They were measuring institutional failure. Later historians would describe these efforts as attempts to separate real deaths from administrative fog. But at the time, the stakes were immediate. Every major operation depended on understanding whether German formations still existed as fighting forces or only as names on paper. The deeper the analysts dug, the clearer the picture became. The German reporting system was not designed for sustained collapse. It assumed movement, communication, and replacement. When those assumptions failed, the paperwork continued anyway, filling gaps with categories that postponed reckoning. Germany's strength, as recorded, was increasingly an illusion. And illusions, once confronted by reality, do not fade gradually. They break. One inconsistency was enough to change how British experts read everything that followed. A unit war diary might describe a failed night attack, noting platoons destroyed and officers killed, yet the corresponding high headquarters summary would report only moderate casualties and stable combat strength. This was not an isolated error. It was a recurring signature. British analysts learned to read German war diaries the way meteorologists read pressure charts. Certain words signaled instability, improvised, ad hoc, no ammunition, no radios. These phrases clustered around formations under extreme stress. Sudden silence in daily entries was even more telling. It often meant that the staff responsible for writing them was gone, displaced, or dead. As 1944 turned into 1945, the pattern intensified. The German system could still generate paperwork even when it could no longer generate reliable information. This raised a deeper question. Why would an army famous for bureaucratic precision allow its own reporting to degrade? The answer lay partly in structure and partly in human behavior. Communication lines were severed by air attack and retreat. Reports passed through shrinkings of command. But there was also motive. Commanders under pressure protected careers. Headquarters avoided panic. Confidence had to be maintained, even when the reality no longer justified it. Under those conditions, the reporting system began smoothing the story it told itself. Losses became temporary. Missing became permanent ambiguity. Death became a statistic that could be postponed indefinitely. British analysts realized they were no longer dealing with a neutral accounting mechanism. The war logs were participating in the collapse by masking it. From that moment on, German totals lost their authority. They became behavioral evidence rather than factual truth. The numbers revealed how the system responded to stress, not how many men were actually gone. And once that shift in perspective occurred, a harder question emerged. If death could be hidden administratively, then how many men had already vanished into the margins of history without ever being properly counted? Faced with unreliable totals, British analysts turned to reconstruction. If the center could not be trusted, the edges had to be examined. They focused on indicators that were difficult to falsify: unit strength over time, replacement flows, prisoner counts, hospital capacity, the arithmetic of formations that disappeared from order of battle lists entirely. A division that began a month with 15,000 men and ended it with 7,000 had suffered losses whether the paperwork admitted it or not. Multiply that pattern across armies and fronts and the scale of the hidden attrition emerged. Studies of German manpower later confirmed what British experts were seeing in real time. The category of missing absorbed enormous numbers of men whose fate was never corrected in the system. Late war conditions accelerated this process. German units fragmented into small battle groups. Records were lost, burned, or never written. Communication collapsed. Under those circumstances, hidden deaths did not require deliberate deception. They required friction, cold weather, fear, exhausted clerks, broken radios. The system continued functioning, but its outputs drifted further from reality. British experts understood something critical, whether intentional or structural. The result was the same. Numbers protected the institution rather than revealed the truth. War logs ceased to be accounts. They became autopsies unfinished, incomplete, and still trying to appear orderly. By reconstructing losses from what remained visible, British analysts exposed a manpower crisis far deeper than official German figures suggested. The army was not just losing men, it was losing the ability to know where its men were, and that kind of ignorance carries consequences far beyond statistics. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is absence. Intercepts fell silent. Units that once reported daily vanished from communication networks. Headquarters issued confused fragments instead of clear orders. British intelligence, seasoned by years of signals analysis, understood that silence was not emptiness. It was a symptom. When analysts cross-checked captured German logs against the wider intelligence picture, contradictions sharpened. A diary might describe an orderly withdrawal, while other sources showed communications collapsing and resistance evaporating. The paper map still showed lines. The battlefield had gaps. At that point, the investigation shifted focus. It was no longer about totals. It was about tempo. How fast was Germany losing the ability to track its own forces? Because once an army cannot accurately report casualties, it cannot allocate replacements. Without replacements, combat power cannot be restored. Units continue to exist on paper while fighting with ghosts. Late-war German paper strength increasingly misled both German planners and Allied observers. British experts were not just uncovering hidden deaths, they were watching an administrative nervous system fail. Reports lagged behind reality until they became irrelevant. The system that once provided clarity now produced delay, and delay, under conditions of rapid collapse, was fatal. As the failure accelerated, a darker realization emerged. Many of the men listed as missing would never be corrected. Their absence would remain unresolved, their deaths administratively suspended. The system could no longer close its own accounts. By early 1945, German reporting still produced totals, but those totals had become ritualized. Units were renamed, merged, and reformed with fewer men and less training. War diaries recorded combat groups assembled from survivors. Administratively, the army persisted. Operationally, it was hollowing out. For British manpower analysts, the key signal was not a single catastrophic number, but the slope of decline. Strength returns fell faster than replacement systems could respond. Losses were no longer managed. They were absorbed until structure failed. This was attrition turning into collapse. Hidden deaths were now embedded everywhere, missing men who would never be accounted for, killed figures that lagged behind reality, wounded evacuated without records, prisoners taken in mass surrenders and encirclements. Whether caused by deception or disintegration, the outcome was the same. Official figures understated devastation. When the war ended, the documents became all that remained for many of the men they failed to count. For British experts, those records were no longer intelligence tools. They were evidence of how a modern state could lose vast numbers of lives while maintaining the appearance of administrative control. The final task was no longer analysis. It was reckoning. After victory, the work continued in silence. British experts compared German ledgers against the physical aftermath of war prisoner columns, empty depots, shattered units that existed only as stamps and signatures. This was not courtroom drama, it was arithmetic with human consequences. Later scholarship would confirm how difficult it was to separate missing from dead, especially in the final months when collapse peaked. The legacy was not just the deaths themselves, but the failure to name them in time. The investigation revealed that hiding could be intentional, but it could also be structural. Systems built for control struggle to describe uncontrolled disaster. The most unsettling discovery was not a single forged report. It was the consistency of the pattern. Clean summaries at the top, disorder below, a widening gap filled with missing names. A war log ends neatly. The unit does not. In those crates, the truth remained incomplete. Silence did not erase death. It delayed acknowledgement. And in that delay, thousands of lives slipped from record into memory alone.